Thank you very much, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to start off by thanking Kari for hosting me. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. I apologize for delivering the speech in English. I wish I could do it in Spanish. Hopefully next time I'm here, my Spanish will be good enough. Hopefully, hope so. I'd also like to thank the Africa and Middle East group for organizing this, as well as Professor Hachik Dergogasyan, who also was one of the organizers in this. So thank you all very much, and thanks to everyone else who was involved with putting this together, and mostly thank you all for coming today. The title chosen for this talk was Peace in the Middle East After the Arab Uprisings, and as was mentioned, it's difficult to speak of the issue of peace at this very moment. And I wanted to start off with 3 news items just from the past weeks as an introduction to what I'd like to speak about. The first headline comes from Israel and Palestine, and that is the ongoing violent confrontation taking place right now. As of yesterday, around 500 Palestinians were killed, and about the most recent news is 20 to 25 or 30 Israelis, the estimates vary, have been killed as well. The latest round of fighting started July 6 after the kidnap and murder of 3 Israeli teenagers, for which the Israeli government blamed Hamas and launched a series of raids in the West Bank, arrested many Hamas members, and after the killing of some Hamas members, Hamas launched rockets into Israel, and the fighting continued as we see in the news. The second headline comes from Iraq, and it comes from Mosul, the north of Iraq. And the headline says that for the first time in 1,900 years, the city of Mosul has no Christian population. And the Christian population was driven out after the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or Islamic State of Iraq and Sham, ISIS, took over the city and recently ordered the Christians to leave or stay and pay a tax or face death. And they had been going around and painting the houses of Christians. They painted a red mark over them to mark which are the Christians. And after that point, the Christian population left. The third piece of news comes from Syria, which is where I'm from. This news, unfortunately, did not make the headlines because of the fact that the violence has become normalized to a certain extent. But by last month, the United Nations High Commission on Refugees declared that the number of registered refugees had passed 2.8 million Syrian refugees. And this is out of a country of less than 23 million people. That's the total population of Syria. Over 160,000 have been killed, or at least these are the estimates. The United Nations, in fact, has decided to stop counting the number of dead in Syria because they said they could not actually get an exact figure. But the estimates are about 160,000. About 7 to 8 million of this 23 million population have been displaced. So between 40 and 50% of the entire population of Syria has been displaced from their homes, and many of them are not able to return and may not ever be able to return. And certainly not immediately, because around 2 million houses have been damaged or entirely destroyed in Syria. I mentioned these 3 news items, these 3 stories, as a way of introduction. And I mentioned them in that order because the first news item of Israel and Palestine is a news item which unfortunately we have come to be familiar with in the Middle East. This is the traditional conflict in the Middle East. Usually when we speak about peace in the Middle East, we are referring to peace between Israelis and Palestinians. But I mentioned the other two as well because when we now speak of peace in the Middle East, we have to take into account something else that is much more than only the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. And what I'd like to do for the remainder of the talk is to try and shed some light on how these processes came to be. What are the origins, historically and recently, of how we came to have these processes that manifested themselves in the news items that I mentioned. And I start with Palestine and the role of Palestine and the situation of Palestine in the Middle East, because Palestine is part of what made the Arab region a region. The title of the talk is, after the Arab uprisings, and in the past several decades, there was a regional system, especially in the post-World War II period, a regional system in the Arab world. And this regional system had three things that glued it together, even if there were separate states and even if there were many forces dividing those states, but they were integrated in a sort of way. And the cultural glue that kept them together was Arab nationalism. And Arab nationalism was as many of you know, the belief throughout the Middle East, North Africa, and the Arabic-speaking countries that these countries shared a linguistic, cultural, historic commonality, and that this commonality can be a basis for integration, can be a basis for coming together politically, economically, socially. So Arab nationalism was really the cultural force that drove these countries together or to cooperate with one another. This had an economic dimension to it as well, and the economic dimension was a system of exchange between the Arab countries. It wasn't capital flows, but it was labor flows. Many of the highly populated Arab countries like Egypt, like Syria, would send workers to work in the oil-rich countries, the Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and these laborers would send back remittances, which would form a large part of actually the GDP of many of those countries. In addition, the oil-rich countries would send aid and grants to the other Arab countries. And so there was a system of economic exchange that was not trade. The trade exchange was very low, but it was other forms of economic exchange through labor and aid. And there was a political force which glued them together, and that was Palestine in many ways. In the sense that the view throughout many in the Arab world was that the establishment of the State of Israel and the dispossession of the Palestinians was a tragedy and was a disaster for all the Arab countries, because it was viewed as a continuation of colonialism. And the State of Israel was viewed by many of the Arab populations and many of the Arab countries as a continuation of colonialism and an alliance with the colonial powers, through its alliance with the colonial powers. And that's why many of them rallied around the cause of the Palestinians as a result of this belief. And so periodically, the Palestinian cause would be, in many ways, a key political rallying cry for many of the Arab populations. Now, of course, not all the countries were committed to this regional system. Not all the countries were committed politically or economically. And certainly not all the countries were committed to the cause of the Palestinians. I'm speaking here of the Arab countries. But in a sense, these forces were very strong, such that all the countries had to respond to them. All the leaderships of the countries had to respond to them in some way or another. And even when you had more conservative or more radical Arab countries, both the conservative and the Arab countries in turn had to respond to this. However, this regional system, that I'm calling it a regional system, started to break down in the 1990s for many reasons. Starting with 1967, which was the 1967 war that was a complete defeat for Egypt and Syria at the hands of Israel. Arab nationalism started to lose its momentum, and the big defeat was the defeat for one of the leaders, the biggest leaders of Arab nationalism, Jamal Abdel Nasser, the leader of Egypt. And his defeat meant, in many ways, the beginning of the decline of the driving force behind Arab nationalism. And given that Egypt was the biggest and remains the biggest and in many ways the most important Arab country, that defeat in many ways signaled the beginning of the decline. Several other things were happening that were also pushing this to the back, which is that in many ways Saudi Arabia increasingly became more assertive as a counterweight. Even though Saudi Arabia was in many ways publicly supportive of Arab nationalism, it saw in Egypt's leadership, to a certain extent, and it saw in the radical ideas of Arab nationalism a threat. And since the 60s and 70s, tried to promote a counterweight to that threat. There were two kinds of threats that Arab nationalism posed from the perspective of Saudi Arabia. The first threat was the ideas of Arab nationalism were more secular and not based on religion other than a very broad cultural sense, in the sense that there was an Islamic religion, but that was a more cultural influence rather than a strict interpretation or practice. So Arab nationalism was very secular, and the Saudi Arabian state and ideology practiced a very strict form of Islam. The second was in the economic program of Arab nationalism, which was very redistributive, which viewed in its most radical elements, that was even promoted by Nasser, the president of Egypt, that all the oil wealth throughout the Arab world belongs to all the Arabs, and therefore the Arab oil-rich countries were in fact entitled to redistribute the oil wealth. So in many ways, this did not sit very easily with Saudi Arabia, and they promoted an alternative to this, a more Islamist alternative to Arab nationalism. Starting in 1962, for example, they established the World Muslim League, and the World Muslim League was explicitly meant to be a counterweight to the more secular Arab nationalist ideals. This process increased the funding and the support for the Islamist push increased with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, whereby Saudi Arabia in many ways was a conduit or was an arming and financing source for many of the Islamic mujahideen which traveled to Afghanistan to fight the Soviet invasion. And therefore these ideas, the more conservative or radical Islamist ideas, were being put forward during this period of time, initially as a counterweight for Arab nationalism. So at the cultural level, the Arab nationalist system began to decline. At the economic level, also the system began to decline because most of the oil-rich Arab countries started replacing Arab labor with South Asian labor. If you go to the oil-rich countries, like Dubai, if you go to Dubai, for example, if you go to Qatar, most of the labor that you see is in fact South Asian and not Arab. And in many ways, this was a deliberate policy that was undertaken starting in the 90s, because Arab labor was viewed A, as too expensive, but B, as too politically destabilizing. And you had periods of time where in fact not only less Arab laborers were admitted to these countries, but in fact sometimes they were expelled. So many Palestinians were expelled from Kuwait after the liberation of Kuwait, for example. So the cultural glue started falling apart, and then the economic glue started falling apart. And eventually the Palestine issue also started becoming less of an issue, and and the Palestinians started getting less support from these countries. The collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s meant that the more radical Arab nationalist countries, such as Syria, Iraq, Algeria, Libya, they lost their traditional ally. And in many ways, the US was the uncontested power in the region in the 1990s. And the US increasingly put pressure on the many Arab countries to initially drop their hostility to Israel, increasingly put pressure on the Palestinians, and they themselves come to normalize relationships with Israel. Increasingly, they were pushed to take on trade ties. So, for example, Jordan, in their free trade agreement with the US, part of the explicit agreement is to increase commercial ties with Israel through economic circuits of exchange. And so the Palestine and the Palestinians felt increasingly isolated. And in the early 1990s, Yasser Arafat, who was the head of the PLO, determined that he had no choice but to come to terms and sign a peace agreement with Israel called the Oslo Accords in 1993, because after the first Intifada from the late 80s, Israel looked to try and come to terms with the increasingly restless Palestinian population in the West Bank and Gaza. And Yasser Arafat signed the Oslo Peace Accords. At that time, the Oslo Accords called for a 5-year transitional period. So by 1998, the idea was that Israel would withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza, and they accepted the creation of the Palestinian Authority, who would undertake the security and who would commit themselves for undertaking the security, preventing Palestinian attacks against Israel. So the idea is that Israel would withdraw in return for peace, land for peace. That was what the peace treaty was called. Until today, of course, as we know, Israel has not withdrawn from the West Bank, and in fact, in many ways, the settlements have in fact increased. The encroachment in many lands, in many territories in the West Bank has increased by Israel, and they have extended control throughout the West Bank through increasingly complicated systems of not just settlements, but road closures, checkpoints, the separation wall, which was built for security reasons, but which encroaches on Palestinian land. Increasingly, life is becoming more and more difficult for the remaining Palestinians, and they're in fact, this has precipitated a process of urbanization, whereby increasingly the Palestinian farmers are unable to actually stay in their lands and in the villages, and most of them are heading to Ramallah, for example, which is the largest Palestinian city. Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005. However, they withdrew from inside the city, but controlled it from every side, except one, which is controlled by Egypt, which is the Rafah border. But other than that, there's almost a total blockade, and since 2007, a total blockade on Gaza, where the basic, even basic nutritional items are denied. Since this period of time, Israel has practiced a policy that can be summarized, I would say, as maximum Palestine, minimum Palestinians. The process is increasingly to try and take de facto control of as much of what is called historic Palestine as possible. And a lot of what what is taking place in the last decade of periodic fighting can be understood in that sense. I could talk more about the most recent round of fighting if you wish, but in many ways the process of increasing closures, increasing dispossession of the Palestinians is part of the core fuel for the conflict. However, this is only part of what is taking place, and I'd like to return to this issue, but revisit this issue after I look at the other factors that I mentioned. And one of the things that I was mentioning was the increasing assertiveness of Saudi Arabia as a counterweight initially to Egypt, and its, in many ways, support of an alternative ideological project to Arab nationalism. This process took on a very different shape after 1979 with the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And after 1979, Saudi Arabia came to view Iran as a danger in many ways, in the same way that it viewed Arab nationalism as a danger. And in many ways it was even more, because the Islamic Revolution in Iran was not secular, it was explicitly a religious-oriented. It was accused by Saudi Arabia of trying to export the revolution, of trying to radicalize the Shia populations that are outside Iran. And by historical accident, the majority of the Shia population in Saudi Arabia is located where the biggest oil fields are. And so there's always this possible threat, this possible idea that Iran might radicalize the local Shia population and cause trouble, and that their allegiances are more to Iran than to the domestic population. So starting in the late 80s, the counterweight to secular Arab nationalism was shifted to a Sunni Shia battle. It was no longer denouncing the secular Arab nationalists. It was increasingly denouncing the Shia population as apostates or non-Muslims or people who are in many ways un-Islamic. That was a lot of the propaganda that was being put forth at that time. Now, it's important for me to talk a little bit about the Syrian uprising and some of the details of this Syrian uprising and the complexity, to shed light on how the region is facing, as I mentioned in the beginning, a crisis which is unlike the traditional crises that we faced before, and how increasingly attaining peace is something that is much more complex than it was before. The Syrian uprising, in many ways, which started in March 2011, was fueled by some of the same drivers which fueled all the other Arab uprisings. The same as Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, Libya, which is fundamentally dissatisfaction with decades of authoritarian rule. And Syria in particular was a country which was, I would say, the most advanced, I don't know if that's the right expression, but was the most advanced in its denial of basic civil liberties and political freedoms. The Syrian current regime under Bashar al-Assad was taken over from the father of Hafiz al-Assad, who came to rule in 1970. Bashar al-Assad came to rule in 2000. And in many ways, the authoritarian rule of his father was continued. Some of the most severe restrictions were relaxed, but still there was a ban on any independent organizing, any independent political parties, a criminalization of dissent in many ways. But add on to that in the 2000s, there were increasingly, as in many of the Arab states, high levels of corruption and economic inequality. The best way to put it is that the levels of elite capture of the economy went to unprecedented levels. For example, a former Ministry of Economic Planning, or people who were involved with economic planning in Syria, did a study and found that in the decade of rule under Bashar al-Assad, 50% of every single government contract issued by the Syrian government went to 5 people only. And these 5 people were the business partners of the president and the cousin of the president, whose name is Rami Makhlouf, who's a very powerful person. At any rate, the initial impetus for the uprising was a protest against authoritarianism and against corruption and economic marginalization or economic exclusion. Over the first year, and by March 2012, the uprising had been violently suppressed by the government, but something else took place of the protest movement. And what took place of the protest movement was a proxy war between, largely, I would say, Saudi Arabia and Iran. But not just Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Turkey were involved as well. So at the start of the Syrian uprising, the main allies of the Syrian government were Iran, and we've seen Russia and China emerging as allies, but mainly Russia, in addition to Iran, supporting the Syrian government. From the perspective of Iran, the Syrian uprising threatened to remove its main ally in the region. And since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Syria had been Iran's main ally. And Iran views itself as being under siege, as being under sanctions. It's already under sanctions. It views itself as being under siege, under threat of perhaps military action for its nuclear program. So Iran saw, from their perspective, that there was an attempt by its opponents, or specifically by the Gulf countries, to insert a system of rule in Syria that would then be used to further encircle Iran. And so, from the very beginning, their commitment to the Syrian regime was as a result of this, to prevent this thing from happening. At the same time, increasingly, the Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and many sources from inside Kuwait and the Emirates were funding more Islamist, Sunni Islamist groups who were in many ways establishing a rhetoric that was quite sectarian. And in many ways they were denouncing the government not due to its authoritarianism, not due to its economic program, but were denouncing the government as Shia, as Alawites. The government of Syria, the Assad regime, comes from a minoritarian Alawite population. And so the battle inside Syria became a sectarian war, where the government, supported by Iran and supported by Hezbollah, were fighting militias that were funded and in many ways armed by many sources inside the Arabian Gulf. And Turkey, who also took a stance against the Syrian government, was a main conduit for a lot of these fighters to come through to Syria. And so immediately by March 2012, the Syrian conflict had become a regional proxy war. Now, the position of the big powers is really interesting and adds another level of complexity to this issue, which is that Europe and the US had supported the Syrian opposition and continue to support the Syrian opposition, with, on the other hand, Russia supporting the Syrian government. However, by June of 2012, Russia and the US had come to an agreement. And the agreement was now called Geneva I. So by 2012, the US and Russia had laid out the basic parameters of an agreement where they did not want the total collapse of the Syrian government, the Syrian regime, that there would be an attempt to preserve the institutions of the Syrian state. But beyond that, there would be, the agreement would be through a peace process. Now, what that meant was that there was pressure from the US primarily on the Gulf to mitigate the flow of weapons to the rebels. Essentially, what this agreement did is that it set up the possibilities for an endless civil war. The US and its allies were arming the Syrian rebels just enough that they would continue to do damage to the Syrian government. And Iran and Hezbollah were supporting the Syrian government just enough that they would not collapse. And increasingly, what we've seen is that the Syrian government has been able to turn the tide of the war and to push back a lot of the rebel groups. But meanwhile, the biggest process that was occurring was the fragmentation of many of these rebel groups, because a lot of the sources of funding were not unified. So increasingly, we saw many groups begin to emerge. At least 80 main groups were mentioned last year. And throughout this period, one group was able to consolidate power. Essentially, the rise of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria was the success of one of the many militias in being able to consolidate all the other militias into one. And they did it as a result of their ability to administer the areas that they're under. The plan of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria was to go into territory that had been evacuated by the Syrian government and consolidate their rule there rather than go and fight the Syrian government, essentially. So they were planning since 2013, increasingly, towards the end of 2013, to establish a state. And the term, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, is very literal. They have administrative districts, they have systems of control, they have systems of accountability, they have a judicial system, and so forth. And so they're very serious about attempting to establish the state. The takeover of Mosul gave them a huge source of funds. And in fact, it's estimated that their wealth is about $2 billion. So they have quite a capability. At any rate, what this means is that there are new actors in the Middle East. These actors do receive some funding, but increasingly they're very independent. So recently, for example, Saudi Arabia mentioned that they put all these groups on the terror list, that they're on, they consider them terrorists, and they are fighting them as well. That is a good step, but at the same time, many of these groups are now independent actors on their own, such as the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. So, I'm just going to say a few words in conclusion and open it up for questions and discussion. It's very difficult for me as a Syrian, as someone who was born and raised in Syria, to speak of the idea of peace when I see the tragic consequences that have happened to Syria over the last few years, the tragic results. In many ways, the Syria that I grew up in is gone forever. It's irretrievably lost, and there is increasing evidence that Syria itself might become partitioned in some way. It's already de facto partitioned, and I hope it won't be, but in many ways it's already in the process of happening. I think the issue of, as much of a luxury as it sounds right now, pushing for countries based on citizenship, pushing for countries that respect human rights, pushing for countries that fundamentally strive for equality before the law, is still the project for Arabs who are interested in a positive future. Many of these forces animated the Arab uprisings, and now they become a distant memory, but they have no other choice. In terms of the other conflicts, I think many Arabs feel that they are out of the hands of the Arabs. Many Syrians believe, many Palestinians, of course, have believed that their future is out of their control, that it has become hostage to the larger powers. And I think as long as we don't have a push specifically on the US, on the one hand, when it comes to Israel and Palestine, but also on the regional powers like Saudi Arabia, Iran, as long as there is no comprehensive settlement in the Middle East, which respects the interests of all the countries, not one country over another, but all the countries in the region, the conflict is likely to continue. As long as there's an attempt to completely deny, for example, the basic rights, let's say, of Iran, or as long as the Palestinian question remains unsolved, the right of self-determination and the issue of the Palestinian state, as long as these issues continue unresolved, the issue will, the violence will continue, the problems will continue. And I think what is ultimately needed is a comprehensive regional peace conference that addresses not just the Israeli-Arab issue, but also the other rivalries that I mentioned, specifically the Saudi Arabian and Iranian rivalry, which I think is the other biggest source. Thank you.